of Sunday at QED, the panel title School Daze. I'm your host, Lana Donaghy. Any SWAC listeners in the room? Way! Right, you might remember me from this year's International Women's Day panel. International Women's Day episode of SWAC, where I bored you all about talking about kids, so I've come back to do it again. What we're going to do is we're going to talk on a couple of questions today with our lovely panellists, and then we're going to take some questions from our lovely audience here in the room as well. So I've introduced myself. Anybody who hasn't heard me on SWAC or seen me at previous QED, a brief history of me. I'm Lana. I'm part of the QED team. I'm also part of the Merseyside Skeptics friend of the Merseyside Skeptics, I should say. I don't do any of the hard work, I just turn up and take the credit. And I'm also a full-time streamer on Twitch, and I am a mother of a now 13-year-old autistic boy who is lovely and unfortunately not here today. So I'm going to let our panellists introduce themselves.
I'm Debbie Ging. I'm a professor of digital media and gender in Dublin City University, and my research focuses on online misogyny, male supremacism, but I also do, at the other end of my research, quite a lot of work on educational interventions to address some of these issues with young people, so workshops and other interactive digital resources, and making those resources and piloting them among young people as well.
Wonderful. And to my left?
My name's Andrew Brennand. I'm a secondary school teacher in Kendal in the Lake District. My subjects, I suppose I teach life skills, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. So that engages with a lot of the topics that we're looking at, discerning what makes sense online and what doesn't make sense online, being alert to being radicalised from various sources. I also teach A-level philosophy, A-level psychology, and A-level politics. So I see sort of all bits of the school spectrum, really.
And hello, I'm Karad at Gething, or Chad Gething, depending on which you prefer. I don't mind either. And I've been working in special needs education for the last 25 years, and have, for some reason, been allowed to speak at Skepticamp for a few of those years as well. And this panel happens to be covering some of the content from this year's speech, so hopefully I won't sound completely out of place.
That's it. I was extremely surprised when sitting down to enjoy Skepticamp. Who was here for Skepticamp today? Well, this weekend, it was amazing, wasn't it? And watched your talk, Chad, and I was like, why have they put on a talk of just my panel? This isn't fair. So I'm very pleased to have you here, although you were a late edition. Thank you very much. Right. So last year we did a parenting panel. Turns out parenting is a big subject. We barely got out of diapers in an hour. So today we're tackling the later years of childhood, and I think most of what we're interested in at the moment, in terms of the culture around kids and educators and parents, is around social media. So I've got a couple of facts and figures, and then we'll talk about some things. So it's estimated around 90% of children aged 13 to 17 years old use social media, with more than 50% of those using it daily. I'm definitely sure the number is higher than that, they're just not saying so. So social media in children have been linked to, apparently, anxiety, depression, obesity, eating disorders, anorexia, both obesity and anorexia, self-harm, substance abuse, a load of really, really negative things, right? There's a lot of kind of scaremongering and fear questioning, like scaremongering and fear around social media and kids. So my first question is probably, what threats do social media and misinformation online pose to children? So I'm I'm going to start this side and we're going to go down.
Well, I mean, I think you've outlined some of the more kind of obvious, I want to say, moral panics that characterise a lot of coverage, media coverage, and I suppose also parental concern. But and I say moral panic in inverted commas because a lot of these issues are genuinely problems. But again, I think we can't focus entirely on social media, on technology. You have to look at, what are the root causes socially and structurally that allow these behaviours to proliferate. It's not just, these things aren't just happening online, and they're not just happening because of social media. They may be amplified certainly by social media, and it certainly facilitates different types of behaviours. But these power imbalances, these issues, girls having issues about their body image, or kids bullying each other. If you look at bullying, it's always racist, it's always ableist, it's always sexist or homophobic. These, they're picking up on things that are part of the wider society. So they're using social media, and social media is amplifying a lot of this stuff. But the problems are structural and social. So I suppose, I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, there are lots of specific issues, but we shouldn't get caught up in particular kind of flashpoint issues without actually kind of analysing, well, where did they come from? And there's so much talk about sexting, and of course young people are going to sext. It's normal. It doesn't have to be a negative or bad thing, but the problem is that they haven't been given a kind of a framework of digital ethics around this. But of course young people are going to use technologies like that if they have them. And that's what I think, that's probably the main issue, is that the underlying, digital philosophy or digital ethics or whatever you want to call it is kind of missing. And the focus is always on symptoms, is always on these kind of sensationalist issues. Whereas to me it comes down to something much more kind of fundamental and structural.
Yeah. Really great. So Andrew, you deal with teenagers every day and you teach them critical thinking.
Yep.
Do you see examples of where children are affected by misinformation? Do you think kids are smarter than we give them credit for?
I absolutely see that. I mean, I totally agree with the previous speaker. I think social media is essentially a catalyst that speeds up the reactions between people, that, it just reflects what's going on in society. And I would hope that schools are these days trying to equip kids with the correct critical skills and faculties to be able to filter out, what makes sense as to what doesn't make sense. Do we see it in the classroom? Yes, we do. But I would hope, actually, that certainly the kids I teach, I teach in a comprehensive in Kendal. It's quite middle class, it's quite white. And the kids will bring very often what is brought into the classroom, and I see this especially as a politics teacher. It tends to be there. Very often, if you hear a sort of an outlying opinion or something that might flag up as a concern, something that might make you reach for your prevent form to fill in, it's very often an opinion that's come from home and hasn't been sort of critically questioned at home. So I love it when kids bring that stuff up in classroom, because it means that in a safe environment you can challenge their assertions or their opinions, and show them, I suppose, that there's a way to discuss what can often be very sensitive topics, but let them understand that there are other points of view and there are other ways to reach those points of view. I think the experience in the classroom, my experience in the classroom has been, I would say, almost exclusively wholly positive. Kids might bring in prejudices, concerns, biases, But that's great. I'm glad they're bringing them to the classroom, because then we can talk about them, and then we know we can hopefully help them find their way through the woods.
Brilliant. Is there space in the curriculum for that to happen, do you think, sufficiently? We have, certainly here in the UK, for anyone not native, we have a push from the government to focus education around vocation, and education that doesn't directly lead to employment is deemed unnecessarily and is increasingly defunded. Do we have enough space in the classroom and in the education system to support that?
I think we do. I think very often, the academisation of schools has meant that headmasters have really got an awful lot of discretion on how the curriculum is presented. And certain schools will give a lot of emphasis and credence to, my subject, life skills, personal, social, health education. Other headmasters will sort of reduce the amount of time it has on the timetable. We're incredibly lucky. I get to see years 8s 4 times a fortnight, twice a week, year 9s 3 times a fortnight, year 10s 4 times a fortnight. So in our school, it really is prioritised as a subject, and we are continually getting updates from the government on what should be statutorily taught within PSHE lessons, and we get a lot of advice and guidance and lesson materials. So when the whole incel and Tate thing kicked off, we've got basically off-the-shelf lessons that we can use, we can tailor and address. So there is room in the curriculum and there are materials, but ultimately it's going to come down to the leadership in the schools that your kids are at, whether or not PSHE is given timetable time and treated with the same respect as every other subject, or whether it's 5 minutes from a stress form teacher who would much rather be talking about, uniform infringements or the detention that's coming that night. And then, so ultimately, when you're choosing your schools, you've really got to, you've got to be the discerning customer, I suppose. Sad to put it like that, but I think that's the way it is.
It sort of creates a class system, for want of a better word. If you don't live in an area, or you can't get into a catchment with a school that has that, then your child misses out on that education, right?
Yeah, but I don't think it's necessarily about sort of socioeconomic status or the wealth of an area. I think some of the best schools that deal with this the best might be operating in the most deprived areas,
I live literally spitting distance from Anfield Stadium in Liverpool. Way. And it's an incredibly deprived area, but my son's academy school has a lot of the same programmes that you described there, which is really exciting. Chad?
Yes.
Do we just ban all kids from the internet?
Yes. No. Because, as prohibition in America proved, banning things doesn't necessarily work. No, I wish I could be as optimistic as you, but I'm not, largely because there is that sort of lottery system of, are you lucky enough to send your children to a school or live in an area where there is a school that is prioritising it? Because there's nothing coming down from the Department of Education that says this is a serious problem and we need to tackle it. You are relying on the leadership of your school, and leadership is very different from one school to the next, and that means that purely by an accident of geography you will have large parts of the country having their children go to a school where these kind of things that they're seeing online are not challenged. This is something that by the time we're having kids in year 8 and year 9 bringing these questions to school, we've actually missed the boat in a very big way. There was recently on Newsround a story where they were showing AI-generated videos with science content that was bogus science content, and they were showing this to primary school children and asking them what they thought of it. And then after they'd seen these videos, they were telling them, by the way, everything in that video was fake. It was all untrue. That's not the true science behind it. And most of them were shocked. Most of them sort of like, oh, wow, I thought that was true because you were showing me this video. But what's perhaps even more worrying is that even the ones who suspected it wasn't true were persuaded that it must be true because they were seeing a video about it online. And that is where we're sort of like we're missing the boat, because we want to be teaching those critical thinking skills that you're teaching in secondary school. We really need to be starting that earlier on, because misconceptions in education are the hardest thing to get rid of. You really have to get in there early and make sure that we don't start off with a misconception, because otherwise there's that whole cognitive the desire not to be wrong, the doubling down on things that you believe, the ignoring of facts that are inconvenient. And I think that that's one of the real dangers of social media, the fact that we are persuading people to believe things that are just not true before they've learnt the critical thinking skills to actually be able to cope with that.
Yeah. I would have to say I agree with that, if I can just come in again on that, because your students are very lucky, I think. Certainly my experience of going out and talking to young people in schools is that they don't give adequate time in Ireland, and certainly my colleagues that I work with in the UK as well. Particularly, this is more to do with RSE than it is to do with the broader, we call it SPHE curriculum. But obviously, these things can't really be untangled anymore, you know, the kind of cyber safety, digital education, and RSE, because so many of these things are now linked. So I think it's even unclear where this stuff should fit in the curriculum anymore. And I wonder if there shouldn't just be a module in digital ethics, or philosophy should be mandatory. I think that would solve a lot of problems. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the young people are telling us now, we don't get anything. They just tell us, don't do this, don't do that. Even in the most progressive schools that we've been out in, they're bringing, you know, an expert, but that's just somebody whose dad works in Microsoft. He comes in, tells them all not to share nudes online, because if they do, they might never get a job. You know, it's completely violating any sense of, you know, of consent, of, you know, it's all victim blaming kind of discourse. It's don't do this, don't do that, block, delete, report. It's, you know, reactive. It's not teaching them any kind of critical engagement. It's not teaching them what their rights are, and there's no sense of actually criticising the architectures and the political economy of social media. Like, why do all these rich people own this? Why do we even think that, you know, I mentioned this yesterday, why do we even think that this should be a space for democracy or debate? It's privately owned, it's for profit. We provide free labour for these platforms. I mean, the whole thing is screwed up in the first place, but you know, we need to teach kids how to understand that and be critical of, you know, of the ownership model, of the economic model of social media. You know, that's the real kind of critical thinking that they need to develop. And at the moment, I think they have a lot of, you know, digital skills. They're very tech savvy, but they lack that kind of critical engagement, or the ability to say to the person who comes in from Microsoft, to give them the cyber safety. I mean, even, you know, this is a reactive framing of the issue. It's not to do with your rights or your citizenship or whatever. You know, they don't have any engagement. This is not a two-way thing. People just come in and talk at them, and that's what they tell us all the time. We're just being talked at constantly and told, don't do this, don't do that. Whereas the workshops that we brought into schools were, you know, interactive and creative, and they said, this is the first time anyone's ever asked us what we actually think about this stuff. So, you know, there is a void there, I think, even in the most well-meaning schools. The structures don't really accommodate critical pedagogy, because, you know, it's
interesting, the psychology
kids, right?
of it as well, because, you know, if I say to everybody in the room, don't think of an elephant, then the first thing you think of is an elephant. And when you tell kids, don't look at this stuff online, the first thing they do is they go and they look it up, and the ones that didn't go and look it up will get it shared by their friends. Yeah. So,
and they tell us that themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, the first thing they say is, like, if a teacher tells us not to do something, this is the first thing we're going to do. You know?
Yeah. So my next question was about how do personalities like Andrew Tate, obviously we talked about how social media platforms themselves are privately owned, they're a privately owned company. We do provide free labour for them, and our outrage, our arguments, our spreading of misinformation, that share all makes Facebook Instagram, X, money. Does X make money? No. Sue me, Elon. Obviously we know that that's the case, but there's a tremendous amount of personalities on those platforms who are making a great deal of money by creating content. So how do these, and it's many of them have realised that content that appeals to young, vulnerable people is content that creates wealth. So how do these people, the most notable of whom at the moment, certainly in the news, is Andrew Tate, how do they factor into this? Anybody not know who Andrew Tate is in this room? Brilliant. So Andrew Tate, I'll give you a very brief. Andrew Tate was he's an American-British born man. He was a kickboxer back in 2005. He won a championship in 2009. He rose to fame after being in Big Brother in 2016, the TV program Big Brother, which he was kicked out of after it was leaked that there was a video in which he was violent against a woman. And now he's an internet personality. He created this Hustlers University, which sells people on the idea that these are quick, easy answers on how you become rich and powerful, and women will be attracted to it. He's been very criticised for promoting violence against people, especially women, and misogyny in general. And last year in 2022, he was arrested, him and his brother were arrested in Romania on charges of human trafficking, which they both deny. So that's a brief history on Andrew Tate, and I'd love to throw out some opinions on how personalities like him affect kids.
I mean, the first I heard of Andrew Tate was when a year 8 asked me while I was on duty, what did I think of Andrew Tate? And at the time, I didn't have an opinion, so I had to go and find out about him. And this kid was quite keen to find out what I thought about Andrew Tate. The way duty rotas work in schools was, next Tuesday break, he would be able to come and find me again and says, did you find out? What did you think about Andrew Tate? And I said, I think he's a bit of a tosser. And this kid was really excited by the fact I'd said the word tosser. And so, which is kind of how year 8s roll, really. So next week, Tuesday break, he's got a whole gaggle of friends. Sir, what do you think about Andrew Tate? Well, I still think he's a tosser. And they're not really used to teachers talking freely and openly like that. I thought tosser was an acceptable phrase to use for year 8. But they wanted to engage me in a conversation about it, and I said, well, what I've learned is this, and clearly these are the problems, and they were very well. The one kid, the sort of the evangelist, I suppose, for Andrew Tate, was very. We had the talking points down. He knew how to refute something, so he'd clearly watched a video about Andrew Tate that taught him how to refute the points. And over time, we continued our conversations. The year 8s weren't having lessons on this at all. They do have lessons on critical thinking, but we don't specifically talk about incel culture and things like that. And then, of course, Andrew Tate's legal inconveniences occurred, and the conversation continued. Tuesday break. So, what do you think about Andrew Tate now? Well, I think he's a rapist, I would say. And that actually. That gave them pause for thought. Now, I'm not trying to assert that there aren't still Andrew Tate evangelists in classrooms, but I would say they're a minority, certainly in the classes in the school I teach. Now, there are 10 million kids at school in the UK, and I see about 300 of them. So I'm not going to try and make out that my experience is in any way representative. But the kids who, the year 9 lessons which we've done on incel culture and things like that, it's almost like the class knows, you'll want to talk to insert name of child here because he's got a strong opinion about this. And voicing the strong opinions on things like Andrew Tate gives a kid a kind of minor celebrity status within school, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the school agrees with him. He's seen as somewhat as an outlier, a bit of an oddity. And of course, kids love to divert classroom talk, if they can get a teacher talking about another subject, then they'll love to do that because it means they're probably not asking them to do any work. So we do lessons like on the critical thinking and online safety, and I do actually in my lessons talk about the sort of the economic structure behind social media. I mean, it's an old truism, isn't it, that if you're not paying for something on the internet, you're the product. All my kids know that, so they'll approach the material like that. What am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that, yes, there are still people who, when they ask me what I think about Andrew Tate, and I say he's a rapist, that they will still attempt to defend him, but they're in a huge minority, and the vast majority of kids in their year, in the school, are aware that these people are essentially just, it's the old, there's always an exhibitionist in the class, isn't it? And this is the mechanism that you can choose to be an exhibitionist. I guess that's failing to appreciate the damage that talking about that wider culture does. But that's my experience in schools.
So that's on a small scale.
Yep.
Big scale?
Yeah, I mean, well, I feel like I know Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan quite intimately at this stage, because I've coded about, and I'm not finished, 1,000 TikTok videos and YouTube short videos, manually coded them, and I'm not done. And my research assistants have done way more than me, so I'm actually going to offer them some therapy at this point, because it's just like, honestly, awful. But a lot of it is actually just really incredibly boring. He's a narcissist. He a lot of what the previous main stage speaker was saying about what's his name, Alex Jones, applies to Andrew Tate. He's a narcissist. His father was a bully. There's a lot of stuff that you can start decoding about why he is the way he is, and it's just whatever comes into his head as well. They just talk shite, both of them, constantly. But you can see why it's compelling, because a lot of it's about money. Most of it's about money and how to get rich and how to get fit and get up and do 100 press-ups and just keep working. He's obsessed with the idea that he's always working. And you can see that, this is quite compelling for young people who are kind of looking for maybe some structure or are interested in making money. That he seems to make, it all sounds very simple, and he's an entrepreneur and he's had massive success. He claims to be a trillionaire sometimes, but I think he's rolled that one back. So it's just all very appealing. And the other thing is that it's become, it's a way to wind people up. It's like you say, it's a it's a tool, or something you can use to young people have learned very quickly, I suppose, that you get an immediate reaction, especially from female teachers, especially from your mother, your parents, if you mention Andrew Tate. So it just has this instant kind of reaction, which is quite exciting, I suppose. So we found the same. A minority in the classrooms were resistant to what we were trying to teach, and they were quoting lots of Andrew Tate stuff. But it is a minority. It's the messers. It's the lads. And if they're not using Andrew Tate, it's going to be something else. It's a difficult group always, I think, to reach. What impact has he had? I think it's massive. I hate, this focus on this one personality, and yet his reach is just enormous. He's banned from TikTok, and yet I'm coding thousands and thousands of Andrew Tate videos that are still circulating. The content hasn't gone at all. It's made really very little difference. So, I do think it's quite frightening how one individual can have so much reach, and it's an interesting case study, I think, in how social media can amplify the voices of basically idiots, because he is an idiot. He thinks he's highly intelligent, but he really is quite dim. And the theories, I think it's really important, to say, well, hang on. He talks about gorillas. I mentioned this yesterday. He uses the natural world to justify evolutionary psychology, kind of half-baked pseudoscience ideas about gender and stuff. All of this is really easy to deconstruct in the classroom if you take the time out to do it, and you do it in a more interactive way rather than a pedantic way, I think. But all of the ideas, even the theories about how to make money or how the economy works, you can basically deconstruct them in a few minutes, and I think that kind of toolkit would be very useful for teachers to have. I know that there is some, kind of how to deal with Andrew Tate stuff out there, but maybe getting into the actual ideas that they're peddling, would be useful, I think, as well.
What occurs to me is the kids who will now use Andrew Tate as this kind of touch paper to sort of set people off are the same people that back in 2016 would love to talk about Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's almost like having the guy as president has almost, legitimised this. It's no longer a minority worldview, is it?
And they were doing exactly the same thing. They were bringing up Trump in conversations just, to wind people up. Yeah. And also, it was the idea that this guy could become president was appealing to them.
Yeah.
Chad, your talk on Friday was amazing, and this is obviously an area of special interest. So, have you got any opinion on these internet personalities? Do you think it seems to be like? Thanks, mate. It seems to be like social media is a breeding ground for these. Where like megamaniac narcissists can just come and spew, and it just takes the right spark of luck to just, and if it's not Donald Trump who then gets impeached and now is kind of no longer the thing, then it's Andrew Tate, and obviously he is now in a tricky legal situation, for want of a better word. And then are we just now faced with a like rolling path of people?
So one thing I would say to start off with, and this might be very amusing for any Australians in the audience, but Andrew Tate is a tool. So he's a little bit different from Donald Trump in that Donald Trump was handed money and power, from his father's wealth. Andrew Tate is the figurehead of the Hustlers University, but it's not really his idea. He was the kickboxer that got onto Big Brother, and then that gave him an in into media that has then been used by other people around him. And sadly, he probably believes that it's all about him, and that if he wasn't so wonderful, then he wouldn't be in this position of influence. But it's not entirely the case. So there is a difference, but it's not a huge difference. And I hate to say this again, but I'm not as optimistic as you, because 16 to 17-year-old boys, 8 out of 10 have seen Andrew Tate content, and over 50% find him to be more positive than negative. That is just scary. On the flip side, 1% of girls find him positive. Okay? I think we've got a problem with that 1% of girls. Isn't that a typically male response to society? Yeah? No, but it is a real problem that 50% of boys, after having viewed his content, find him to be generally positive. And when we dig down on that, what we actually find is that a lot of these boys don't actually know very much about Andrew Tate at all. They know some of the talking points. They know some of the quotes. They can recite videos where he's got a big fat cigar and he's saying, "Breathe air, breathe air." But they don't actually know that he sent voice notes to one of his victims confessing to raping her. And when you challenge people and say, you do know he confessed to raping somebody, he sent her a voice note. He didn't have to do that, but he did, because he views himself as being above the law. It stops people and it makes them think a bit. But, and again, this is a problem with the fact that it's being relied on individual schools. There's nothing coming down from the DFE to say, yeah, play that recording to people and ask them to make up their own minds. Use Andrew Tate as the tool that he should be used as, to break down this sort of like invulnerability that he has online, and say, this is what the man says. This is him in 2018 saying, yes, I'm a sexist, yes, I'm a misogynist. This is him in 2020 saying that sexual assault victims need to take responsibility for them being attacked. You know, this is him in 2000. And also the Big Brother thing, he was withdrawn when that video came to light, but it was probably also because it was revealed that the police were investigating him for 2 rapes. That in the end, the police admit they didn't investigate properly, and so all charges were dropped in 2019. So that is more probably why he was dropped from Big Brother than the consensual video of him hitting somebody during sex. But it is a real problem that we have so many boys out there who still find him positive, but don't know even half of the terrible stuff that he has done and advocated for. And we really do have to take opportunities like this, him being such a visible character, to try and inoculate society in general, but particularly young men coming through, against these kind of just false ideas about what masculinity should be. You know, the idea that you should walk around your house with a sword to project masculine power.
That's what I do.
And I've never seen anyone more manly than you, Claire. But I make swords, but I don't do them because I want to be manly. I do it because I'm interested in metallurgy and medieval weaponry, because I'm a bit of a nerd. But the idea that I would walk around the house with one to project power to my daughters, well, I think they would laugh more. It's just ridiculous. But he's online saying these things. And he gets banned and thrown off the social media platforms. But then he uses that to his advantage, because he then asks for his followers to repost all of his videos. So they're being reposted by accounts that aren't his, and because it's quotations rather than the actual direct content, these people aren't going to be banned. And then they are financially incentivized to recruit other people to repost them. And it's been described on several outlets as a social media pyramid scheme. So since being banned from social media platforms, he's actually gone on to make huge amounts of money. I think one estimate was he was making £11 million a month just from that, from his online Hustlers University and things. And that's another problem, that people are looking at him and the lifestyle that he is saying, you know, I got a sports car, I got a Lamborghini, you know, Greta Thunberg doesn't have any. That's great, but none of these boys who are saying that they want that lifestyle know where his money comes from. They don't know that that money comes from them subscribing to get his content and from him sex trafficking women and stealing the money from their online sex videos. And when they do find that out, it gives them pause for thought.
Yeah, and I've seen that. I've seen people change their mind.
But we need to be, as not just school to school, we need to be, as a country, responding to it. And, you know, the Department of Education is really terrible at responding to things. It's very bland in its responses. It tends to sit on its hands. And like you said, it says that, well, you know, we'll report and we'll block and things like that. But nobody is actually getting to the heart of why the content is problematic and trying to, again, stop people from actually getting down that rabbit hole in the first place.
I am going to be the voice of optimism again, though, and I know that makes me a minority, I think, on this
really
panel.
Good, because I feel like...
But I don't think the lack of critical faculties that we see applied to all social media content is the exclusive purview of the nation's teenagers. I think the same lack of critical faculties applies across the adult population. And that's because adults weren't taught this stuff either, but there was no reason to teach adults this stuff because they weren't, you know, social media wasn't a thing when they were kids. The fact that this is a problem now and that we're identifying it and we're grappling with it, the next generation should be equipped. Now, I grant you, I totally accept not enough is being done. It's not a central policy. It's haphazard. It's good schools, bad schools. But we are identifying the problem, and you know, Andrew Tate is a tool, and we are using him. And I would hope that, you know, in 10 years, 20 years, adults who have grown up with being exposed to this will have a different outlook. I mean, it's a teaching opportunity, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get
Is
at.
Andrew Tate inoculating kids against bullshit?
We should be using him to
Yeah,
try
absolutely.
to inoculate kids against bullshit. Absolutely.
Brilliant. So this whole panel, to tell a very short story, because I want to get some time for Q&As, even though I'm famously bad at leaving time for Q&As. So my son started high school last year. It was quite an anxiety. Anyone who's ever heard me talk about being a parent will know that I'm filled with anxiety. I followed him to school every day to make sure that he got there okay. I didn't want him to know that I followed him. I legit stalked him. Until I knew that he knew how to walk to school by himself.
See Lana later for stalking tips.
Yeah. You want to know how to do that? I'm basically a private eye. You want to hear what I've got installed on his phone? About 2 months after he'd started school, he came back and we're sitting down for dinner, and he's like, "Mum, who's Andrew Tate?" And I was like, literally my stomach dropped. I was like, oh my God. He wasn't even 12 yet. And I'm like, how am I having this conversation? How do I even have this conversation? And we have all sorts of conversations at our dinner table, as you can imagine, living with Mike Hall. And for me, the way in which we decided to tackle this as a family is we had that frank conversation where we talked about who Andrew Tate was, how he became famous, the things that he has been accused of, how, and most importantly, and I think most impactfully, was how he makes his money via this kind of Ponzi scheme, and how people like this use social media to sell easy answers that are appealing to people in order to extract money from them. I don't think Andrew Tate has the best interest of anybody but himself in mind. And for me, when that question came back to me, I didn't call his school and say, "Why aren't you doing something about this?" I immediately took it on my responsibility as a parent and our responsibility as a family to talk it through and educate him on that. However, I'm also very aware that we're very privileged in that we have the time. We're economically stable enough in that we have the time and the space to sit and do that. So, we've talked a lot about what we think we should do or how we think we should. Debbie, short of hiring your team to educate every school in the country, what more can we do?
It's a really good question. You know, what role do parents have? Because teachers seem to be responsibilised for a lot of this, and obviously there's a lot of concerned parents as well. So, I suppose the way I'm responding, or research is responding, we just got a big Marie Curie doctoral network Horizon Europe grant to do a doctoral network project on parents and online bullying. So I'm leading that consortium, but the PhD that I'm supervising specifically is on parents and intervention, looking out for red flags vis-a-vis radicalisation of their children, particularly their sons, into extreme ideas, into extreme communities. And part of the work package will be to produce a toolkit for parents and teachers around basically red flags that they should be looking out for, and how to kind of positively intervene. So I guess, that's this kind of parent-teacher focus of the network is important, I think. Is this going to, 10 PhDs going to change the world? No. But I do think there has to be more kind of interaction in a kind of structured way, whereby parents and teachers can share information or have a kind of concerted response to this, I suppose. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. I know for myself, when I heard that Andrew was coming on this panel and agreed, I was so excited because school is a black box to which I send my child. And then he comes back and we sit at the dinner table. I'm like, "How was your day?" "Good." "What did you do?" "Art." Okay, great. And it is that world. And I speak to my son's teachers twice a year, and we sit down and we have a 2-minute meeting in which they blast through and say, yeah, it's great, whatever, and then we have to get to the next meeting. That lack of, for me, I'm very privileged enough to understand a lot of the technology involved, but whose responsibility, and therefore I was able to educate my own child about this, but whose responsibility is it to teach parents? Is it their own responsibility? Should they be off teaching themselves? Are schools responsible to interact with the parents in order for them to help their own kids? Is it all on schools? It's such a big problem, right?
Yeah.
I'd love an optimistic view, because we're all feeling a bit worse for wear this morning.
Yeah. Well, I obviously, yeah, your question started with the anecdote of sat around the dinner table, doesn't it? And obviously that's the best place to tackle all of these things. I wasn't quite sure what this panel was going to be covering. When I agreed to do it, I thought it would be a much wider remit of scepticism in education. And I can assure you that kids their default setting is scepticism. Now, I don't teach in a faith school, so maybe that skews my contingent a little bit. But I think the natural ability of kids to question what they are told by adults shouldn't be underestimated and can be leveraged for good. I think there's also other opportunities in schools to reach to kids. I think teaching is all really about relationships and having good relationships with the kids, so they can come and ask you questions, and maybe that you would find out something that was, required intervention because it was sort of going down the prevent line, or that there was a disclosure about something that wasn't going great at home. I'm constantly surprised by our assumptions that everybody's got the same level of digital access. I've got kids in my classes who, if you set a bit of homework online, they'll come to you a bit, sheepishly the next day and say, well, the only item we have that we can use to get on the internet at home is my mum's phone, and she was at work. And so, the level of digital access is not uniform. And, every kid's needs are different. Hopefully there are teachers in every school who, will be approachable if people are worried. And there's a lot of extracurricular opportunities as well. I mean, I used to run a philosophy club, but it turned into a massive argument about politics club, so we turned it into politics club. But you can put yourself out there as a teacher, and hopefully the kids who do want to talk will come and find you to talk about it. The school has got a statutory requirement to reach a certain level of education and to deal with certain topics. I think the DFE is doing a terrible job. It does seem to be in a bit of a fog at the moment. Schools have been waiting now for a long while for the transgender advice, which hasn't come through and seems to have been stymied by the small inconvenience of it being contravening the Human Rights Act, which is why it wasn't released to schools before the summer holidays, like they said. Yeah, it's not an ideal situation. I think we can't make general statements about how schools and parents can interact, because every family situation is unique and different. And yeah, I would say that maybe the apocalypse scenario we're all running in our heads about every teenage boy assiduously watching Andrew Tate. There's a lot of kids in classrooms who haven't got a method to watch a video online. And I guess we've got to be cognizant of that when we try and think of these universal approaches.
I think never underestimate the scepticism of young people is one of my favourite quotes of the weekend. I'm going to print it on a T-shirt. Could I ask a volunteer to hand me the square fuzzy thing over there? My cognitive abilities are rapidly in decline. So I probably have time for 2 questions. A question is a short statement that ends in a question mark. So I'm going to throw it to Aaron, because I really want to hear this one.
Hey, so I read a lot of the post-truth education literature, and it's very heavily emphasizing critical thinking, which I'm concerned is very individualistic as a solution to this problem. Do y'all think that it's actually going to work if we don't do some cleaning up of content moderation on the internet, or do we need to be teaching our students critical thinking is cool, but content moderation is going to be the way to actually address a lot of this?
Yeah, I agree. I think content moderation is absolutely essential. And working with the social media companies is essential. So we work a lot with them. But, they have very slick and impressive corporate social responsibility people who come out and work with us in universities. But, again, the impact that our feedback has on them is quite minimal. And my experience of going to Meta for meetings is that they are very clever at filling up the space, and they leave you 5 minutes at the end, and there's 7 of us from NGOs and universities or whatever, and we get 5 minutes to say stuff because they're just very good at filling up all of the time. So, it's quite hard to work with them on this. But I think, obviously legislation, content moderation is vital for sure. Another thing, though, that I think addresses this kind of individualistic problem is we haven't talked about is teacher training. And to what extent are teachers being trained in critical digital media skills? That has to become increasingly part of their training as well. But again, your Department of Education in the UK, our Department of Education in Ireland, it's the rate of change is very, very slow. And they're quite resistant. Because I suppose everybody wants to have a say in this curriculum, right? Including religious, right-leaning groups as well. Everyone's really quite exercised at the moment, particularly around trans inclusivity, etc. So everybody is now kind of clamouring to get into the curriculum in some way or other. I think it poses a really difficult vista, scenario for teachers and for principals of schools as well. It is a very fraught time in education. But I guess training is essential to review that curriculum as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, most teachers think that they're sort of we understand social media. We've got Facebook pages. And then you speak to kids and it's Facebook? Oh, God, you're so old. We are behind the time, and it isn't part of teacher training. And, I work in a special needs school. Special needs training is still not compulsory for teachers. Wow. So if we haven't even come to an agreement on that, it gives you some idea of how far behind we are on things like social media, and including that in training.
Yeah. I think your anecdote earlier about Andrew Tate videos just being shared by other people, therefore, the fundamental design principle of the internet was that it was supposed to root around damage, wasn't it? And moderation is just interpreted by the internet as damage, and it will root around it. So I think fundamentally, I cannot see the moderation picture improving colossally because I don't think there's motivation there on behalf of the companies, and that's not where the money is. So I think fundamentally the only hope is critical thinking.
Right, one more before I get told off. We up? Catch it. There we are.
Thank you. So you were talking about how you have the advantage of being privileged and having the time to speak to your child, but one thing that also should be mentioned, and I don't know how we would address that with parents, is to actually have the sensitivity and full understanding of what it means when your child asks about Andrew Tate, to grasp the severity of the issue. And I think we see that as skeptics a lot, that we start when we hear just a telltale sign of a conspiracy theory, we already know what that means, but how do we communicate that to parents to understand, okay, this is not a full red flag, this is maybe a half-mast red flag, but this is when you need to really start addressing things because it's going to get really bad if you don't. So how do we communicate this severity?
Well, how do we as parents tell the difference between? No. We don't want to go extreme to, oh my God, my child is an incel, right? Just because he's heard the word Andrew Tate. How do we find those?
How do we teach parents to be sensitive that that's going to be an issue in the future?
I think it's really difficult because it's very, very scary. And as a parent, your response is, I need to protect my child. And to not sort of like give almost the allergic reaction, the over response of the immune system, it's really, really challenging. One of the things that I personally have found has helped in talking to some children about it, and this might be an idea for others to do as well, is to realise that Andrew Tate in some ways is actually a victim as well. You mentioned earlier, his dad was quite a bully, humiliated him repeatedly as a child. He dragged him out of a chess. His dad was a grandmaster in chess, and Andrew Tate was forced to play chess, was forced to enter competitions, and he was dragged out of a chess competition in tears at the age of 12 because he wasn't coping with the competition. And then, of course, the family split up. The parents divorced. Him and his siblings came to live in the UK, and none of that was dealt with as a child. And we now have this misogynist putting these ideas out online. And so part of the way is to say that it's not just that he's a bad person. He actually he's a product of something bad that happened to him and was never dealt with. And that's where these ideas are coming from. So if we actually go right all the way back to the root cause of the problems, focus a bit less on him as a person, but this is what happens if you have unresolved issues in a child and you allow them to just, you just give them all of the sort of the nurturing that they need to grow without actually directing that, without actually making sure that the damaged branches have been trimmed away. And you end up with this problem situation that then spreads through society. So maybe going back that little bit further and encouraging people to have a more empathetic conversation about what the issues are can help take the alarmist side of things down a level and just make it all seem a bit more rational.
I think treating it with compassion, along with everything that we do in terms of scepticism, is definitely the way. Everybody's a victim here. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panellists.
Well done.